Good morning and welcome to our Tuesday, Thursday morning Primetime. We have the privilege of hearing from one of our Faculty Excellence Award winners. We will be doing these at various times during the year. And this event is co-hosted by Faculty Development and Friends of the Library, so we appreciate their support for these events. Chris Gerhz joined our faculty in 2003. He has an A.D. from William & Mary and a Ph.D. from Yale, and he's now an Associate Professor of History. Each year, the faculty nominate different colleagues for awards in teaching, scholarship, and service, and last year Chris was nominated and awarded the Faculty Distinguished Teaching Award. This is how he is described. He's a wonderful teacher in his willingness to embrace new ideas that might be beneficial to the classroom. Most recently, he has co-hosted academic podcasts for the course Christianity and Western Culture, which have featured interviews with 30 Bethel faculty members, Bethel student groups, and guest speakers with an average listening audience of 80. In the classroom, Dr. Gehrz challenges students to think seriously and simultaneously about historical and contemporary issues facing the church. Today he's going to speak to us about significant difference and online and face-to-face learning. Welcome, Chris.
I will say I'm happy to be here, happy to have the chance to talk to you, and thank you all for coming. I'll also say that I'm more nervous about this than anything I've done in 7 years at Bethel. When I got an email from Deb Parlett saying that I got to / had to give a talk related to the field I was awarded for, I've got to say, the idea of talking about excellence in teaching to a bunch of excellent teachers is about the worst thing that I can possibly think of. I can't tell you how much I wish I was somewhere else right now. That said, I did seriously think about politely declining and returning the cash award with this prize. Unfortunately, God, Providence, something has intervened to make an impossible choice. My family is rapidly growing. My wife today is 35 weeks pregnant and expecting not just one child, but 2 children. So I have no choice whatsoever but to stand up here for 40 minutes, get through it, and cash the check. I'm kidding, I already cashed the check. So then I thought, well, why don't I push it back as far as I possibly can? My wife is due around Christmas Eve. We're having a C-section December 9th. And I thought if I wait till late November, maybe we'll just go to labor, but so far, no word. This phone is on though, so it might get me spared. So then I thought, well, maybe since I'm a history professor, I'll talk about something related to history and make it very obscure and something only history majors or professors would be interested in. Maybe not even them. But then I thought, cowardice is not really an academic virtue. And if I've been recognized partly for the fact that I've been experimenting with academic podcasting, maybe I should talk about that. And I think the phrase, the punishment fits the crime, makes a lot of sense right here. So I'm going to try to talk to you about my reflections on online versus face-to-face education. I love the word reflections, students. For professors, reflections mean that we don't have any empirical data for this. There's no there's no analysis going on. It's just me spewing forth ideas. So, okay, now that you really want to listen to all of this, let me establish my credentials, which are minimal. I have not taught a fully online course before. I got started largely thanks to that guy over there. He should be up here giving this talk. Sam Mulberry is the mad scientist behind podcasting at Bethel. He's the one who said, she said, let's do CWC, the radio show, then he made it possible. And so I blame both of them. CWC, the radio show, is a podcast we've been doing for 7 semesters now. It's an optional supplement for the course GES 130, Christianity and Western Culture, which, as many of you probably know, is a course that a lot of students take their first year. It's a Western Civ survey combined with some philosophy, theology, church history, art history, other things. And this is not a required element of the course, but it's something we offer to students, in the words of Professor Heck, to help develop an intellectual subculture at Bethel, to help curious students hear more from the professors, to help humanize us to an otherwise large class. Since then, we've done some other things. We've developed a podcast that goes along with an assignment in the course, and we've also even replaced a lecture on Islam with a podcast in which we pair conversations with Amy Poppinga, who's an Islamic studies expert, with a discussion about the Crusades with Mark Bruce, who's our medieval literature specialist, which we just did recently. So, I mean, that's where I kind of got introduced. And then out of that, I decided to take a shot a couple years ago at replacing a larger number of lectures in History 354, Modern Europe, with podcasts. So History 354 is an upper division course mainly taken usually by 15 to 25 history, social studies, education majors, some of whom are here today. Thanks, guys. Sorry you don't get to listen to this podcast this semester. But I've done this twice now, and basically the model is this. That I take 10 or 11 lectures and replace them with 60 to 70 minute podcasts that include mini lectures, usually 3 or 4 10 to 20 minute discussions where I'm talking about something and there's a PowerPoint and a study guide that goes with it. But I also do things like interview a faculty expert and other kinds of interviews, but also some much goofier stuff. Like we do a news desk, we do ads. This episode of Radio Modern Europe brought to you by the Habsburg Empire, struggling to stay alive since 1800s. It's required for students. They have expectations not only to listen to the podcast, but there's a study guide that goes with it. There are readings that are attached to it, or there were readings that are attached to it. And then there's always a quiz that follows it. So it's different than CWC, the radio show. And this is something I assume students listen to, and it's just a different way of doing what I otherwise would be doing with lecture. But I didn't just want to record a lecture. As you'll hear several times at this point, I have enormous bias against the idea of just recording lectures, slapping it up and saying that's a podcast and that's online learning. I'm kind of intellectually offended. It's lazy and uncreative and not fun, most importantly. So I thought, well, I've heard of All Things Considered. I don't listen to it, but that would be a fun model. Let's try to do that. So it's kind of a news magazine, and it usually starts with something that sounds a little bit like this. This comes from an episode about World War I and the Versailles Treaty that followed the war. Late in 1918, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns of the Western Front finally fell silent. 6 hours earlier that morning, representatives of the tottering German military agreed to a ceasefire on a railroad car in a forest less than 40 miles from Paris, a reminder that the Western Front was never far from the center of French life. Thousands more died in the last spasm of fighting, as the different fighters sought to secure their bargaining position before the looming peace conference. The end of World War I, the peace conference at Versailles, and the system it produced, our topic this week for Radio Modern Europe from the Bethel University History Department. We shamelessly rip off REO on this radio for Europe. So about 10 or 11 of these. One in fall of 2008, I actually recorded on the road. I was visiting my wife's relatives in Des Moines. We got stranded by an ice storm. I didn't want to just skip class, so I actually kind of improvised a 60-minute episode about politics after 1945. So why did I do this? Well, number one, I really love teaching Modern Europe. It's a course I teach every fall. It's actually in my area of expertise, which isn't always true, and it's fun to teach. But European survey course has some kind of basic elements that are repeated every single year. You talk about the French Revolution, the Enlightenment. You talk about industrialization. You talk about imperialism, decolonization, world wars, genocide. You kind of do the same thing over and over again. There were certain lectures I was always bored with giving, and I thought, well, what would be a better way to talk about liberalism and socialism? I'm not an intellectual historian. I'm boring myself talking about this. I bored those students talking about it earlier this semester. So maybe I can do it differently by, interspersing some lectures where I lay out classical liberal economics with, some other things. Like, for example, what if we enlisted Sam Mulberry to act as our foreign correspondent, travel back in time to London in 1848, and interview the author of the Communist Manifesto, played without German accent by Gehrz. Anyway, what's the Communist Manifesto about? Well, it's a manifesto for a party that doesn't really exist quite yet. There really is not a communist party per se. However, it will be the party that will control the inevitable world revolution that's going to reshape world society and the economy. It's an analysis of history, so I lay out my interpretation of where we've been, where we're going. It's an analysis of previous flawed kinds of socialism, usually a bunch of French utopians who don't know anything about history and aren't scientific in any sense whatsoever. And it's a manifesto. It's a list of about 10 planks of this political party, what we're seeking, and why we think that the workers of the world should unite behind it.
Interesting. So we could say, if we wanted to put it in a nutshell, it's your typical friends become enemies, enemies become friends, and it ends in a revolutionary bloodbath.
I know we're past the summer in your time, but it's a good beach read. It's a thing going to take a review or bring it on an airplane once those are invented. Okay, so this is my attempt to do something a little bit more interesting where I play Karl Marx. And it's difficult to do in class because I actually tried this once where I put a picture of Lenin in front of my face and then my TA played Woodrow Wilson and we debated each other. And I'm not sure it came off so well, but this I have a little bit more control over. So I'm taking a different way to lecture. I thought of it as a kind of pedagogical laboratory. Try some things that would be really difficult to do in class and might be just really stupid to try in class. But this way it's entertaining, if nothing else. I also thought this would be a way to reorganize the course, that I could move some kind of lecture pieces around and then free up more concentrated time to do discussion, analysis of primary sources, and especially to watch films. It's always frustrating, even with a 70-minute course, that if you're doing lecture, you've got 10 minutes to watch a great movie. What if you could actually devote pretty much the whole time to watching the film, or at least important clips of it? So this was the idea. I did it fall 2007, liked it enough that I did it again in 2008, and for reasons I'll get back to, I'm taking a break from it this year. So some basic questions I had about this that you might have, and some preliminary observations. Number one, I was kind of curious how much time this would take. This was a fairly ambitious thing to do, and I will say, if this is something any of you are thinking of doing, be prepared to stay here until 7 o'clock at night most nights. It took a lot of time. And it wasn't even the technology so much. I'd actually done a lot of home recording in graduate school, because I fancied myself a songwriter, which we don't need to talk anymore about. But I knew how to do it. I knew how to work with GarageBand, so even though there are 30 audio tracks on any episode of this, that wasn't so hard. But even that took a little fine-tuning, and then designing all of this, recording the interviews, pulling out music clips from the library upstairs, because I thought music would be a really important way to convey European culture that I couldn't do as easily in lecture. It took a lot of time. Although I would say, once you got past the third or fourth episode, you started to get better at it. One thing that I didn't think enough about is that you have to be careful not to put specific time references because you want to reuse it, which I started to get better about doing. And so in 2008, I'd say the time was drastically reduced. It was probably no more than it normally would be to kind of revise a PowerPoint and do a lecture prep or anything. So I think in some ways it's akin to when we bring in a new faculty member and say, teach CWC even though you're a theologian of the 20th century, or a historian of the 20th century. You've got to spend a lot of time kind of developing those lectures, educating yourself. But then, it gets a little bit easier and you just kind of put it on cruise control. And that's why CWC is such a great course, I guess. Okay. Second question, did it succeed? Was this a good pedagogical library? And I without sounding too self-serving, I think, yeah. I thought this was a different way to do lecture that at least I enjoyed. And I was really excited to do, and I thought worked fairly well. Not only was it a good way to kind of enrich lecture and break with the time-honored tradition of talking for 70 minutes to a captive audience, but I started to find, both in this one and the CWC podcast, that it's a good way to maybe experiment with techniques that you can then bring back into the traditional face-to-face classroom. So, for example, in CWC podcast this semester, Sam, Sarah Shady, and I typically spend the first segment just kind of talking about pop culture. But then the second segment, we feel guilty about that and think, let's talk about something serious. Instead of interviewing someone, we just throw out a topic, usually 5 minutes before we record, and we talk about it. And we found that it works well enough. We're actually experimenting with this in CWC large groups, where instead of us lecturing, we actually just have a conversation on stage and try to invite students into the conversation. So I think we're still working through this, but I think that's an interesting territory to mine. Is there a possibility where you can try things online that might then translate back into the classroom? And then finally, what does this mean for students? How did they react to it? And the first thing I would say is that students were pretty happy with this. Partly because I always replaced class on a Friday or a Monday and said, listen to this anytime during your extended weekend. And partly that was because I wanted them to like me, but partly because I thought one reason to do this is to give students, flexibility, autonomy, ownership of the material. It's up to them to decide when to do it, not just because the registrar says show up at 12:30 and CC 325. And for the most part, they seem to like it. I mention that again, not to be self-serving, but because as you read some of the literature that I'll get to in a second, often what you'll find is even if students learn as well online as they would face-to-face, they often feel worse about it, or they feel like they're not learning well, or they're dissatisfied for some reason. So in some ways, it may be surprising and unsurprising that students are satisfied. One other observation I had, and I did do some assessment with this using idea evaluation, extended questions a couple of times. I was curious, how did they use this? I don't know if they had used podcasts before, if they'd taken online courses before, but how do they study with it? Do they adapt? Do they do things differently than they would if they were in a classroom? And I guess to my surprise, they did it exactly the same way they would if I were lecturing. And they told me, I sat down in one chunk of time with a notebook and the study guide you gave me and the PowerPoint that you produced, and I listened to it in one sitting usually, and I took notes as you talked. And sometimes they would go back over, like you might have missed something, so they'd go back to the beginning of a chapter, and obviously that's an advantage of the podcast. But for the most part, I mean, the uncharitable way of thinking of this is, they didn't really adapt, especially. They figure it's basically the same thing as face-to-face, and they studied the same way as it would be face-to-face. And I'd be curious to see, as students become increasingly accustomed to this mode of learning, if they find different ways of using it. If you break up the class over the period of a weekend, and you spend 20 minutes here and then come back to it and come back to it at different points. So that's something I'm curious about. And then the final question, this gets to the topic, or the title of the talk. Did they actually learn like they would when I'm teaching, like I am this semester, face-to-face, using lectures and discussions and traditional methods? And the language that's often used in the scholarship on this is there a significant difference between online and face-to-face education? And for the most part, my preliminary observation is that no, there's no significant difference. In so much as students are able to learn to recognize, to identify, significant events, ideas, individuals from a European history survey, they do at least as well at these quizzes as they were doing in the quizzes I'm doing this semester and the quizzes I've done in previous classroom lecture-driven courses. And that, at least according to the literature, is pretty much what we would expect. If you're interested in this, go to a website called nosignificantdifference.org. Which is something Matthew Poots pointed us to last November when we had a semi-contentious debate on C faculty about this. And it's run by an emeritus professor at North Carolina State who's archived all sorts of research, articles, dissertations, conference papers, analyzing how well do students learn online, hybrid, face-to-face. And in a few cases, there will be articles saying that there's a significant difference in favor of face-to-face. But the vast majority say either there's no significant difference or there's actually a significant advantage to online. And I read through a few of these. Most of them aren't available immediately unless you have access to those journals. But a few were reproduced or linked on the site. And I tended to buy it. And I'll lay my cards out. I enjoy face-to-face teaching. I think my inherent bias is to think it's a better way of doing it. But I also am a sucker for technology and willing to think that maybe this can be an effective way of doing it. And so concluding from this experience of Radio Modern Europe, I'm willing to buy that students can learn to recall knowledge and maybe even to develop some intellectual skills using online, hybrid, face-to-face. I'm willing to accept that's a possibility, especially for survey classes. Now, within that, I'd say there's significant limits. And if you read the literature, at least the stuff that's available online, the outcomes they talk about are always at very low levels of the cognitive knowledge part of Bloom's taxonomy. They're very rarely getting at things like analysis, evaluation, synthesis, let alone a whole other field of Bloom's taxonomy, something like affective knowledge. They almost never are asking questions like, do students internalize values, for example, which to me is a hugely important part of what we do in a Christian college especially, but generally as educators. And so that's open for question. I guess I still remain a little bit dubious that online can do that as well as face-to-face. But I'm willing to think that, for certain courses, especially survey courses, this is something that can possibly work, and it's probably not a bad thing that colleges are investigating this. But I'd like to end that discussion and say, to me, that's not really the interesting thing about online versus face-to-face. And the title of my talk is A Different Significance. And I actually see two different significances to what online can do and what face-to-face can do. And one would kind of benefit online, one I think would tend to argue very strongly for face-to-face being the dominant mode. So the first different significance, I guess, suggests that we should really invest pretty heavily in online education, or at least in podcasting. And here I'll share a few more things we've noticed living in the iTunes U world, doing CWC, the radio show, Radio Modern Europe, and some other podcasts. And this really has nothing to do with the classroom or course design, but it suggests to me that podcasts at least can help small regional Christian universities like ours reach much larger audiences and even serve our non-student constituencies in ways that are really difficult to do, just like inviting people on campus for homecoming and doing a 20-minute lecture about globalization or something. So let me mention another podcast that Sam, Stacy, and I have done, which we call the Polycast. We did this for the election season last fall. And this was an attempt to do something that wasn't tied to a course at all. I mean, it was kind of a departmental podcast that political science and history did, so we drew on the expertise, especially of our political scientists, using interviews. But we also interviewed local candidates for a state house race. We talked to student groups. Stacy actually built this in as a possibility for an assignment in her parties and elections course. So a couple of students did some analysis of campaign ads in the U.S. Senate race, as podcast episodes. But even though we did this partly for students and partly to model civil discourse by evangelicals for our students, we also, I think, looked beyond students. We were really hoping that our colleagues, faculty, and staff would take part, but also that alumni especially might be interested, and that even people maybe disconnected from Bethel or who'd never heard of Bethel might find out about this. My brother-in-law in Iowa became a devoted listener and is still upset that we don't do this. Okay. One of the other things I've been doing the past year is serving with Robin Haslin and some others on the self-study steering committee. And one of the things Robin is interested in is how does Bethel relate to its constituencies? Another question we're asked for accreditation is how do we encourage lifelong learning? And even at faculty retreat this year, I saw a lot of comments about that criterion. I think it's the one Carol works with, saying that what do we do for our alumni? How do we sustain this idea of lifelong learning, of something that doesn't just stop once you graduate, but continues? Can Bethel provide resources for our alumni, for our churches, for parents, for prospective students, all sorts of constituents beyond those who are enrolled in the day college or in CAPS GS? And I would think this might be a possible model that we could think about. And to judge its success, there were people who listened. We've got some data back from iTunes U suggesting that on average, each episode got about 100 downloads. The most popular episode had 200 downloads. And my guess is, and I know this for a fact, it's not just students. We would get listener email from especially alumni who are interested to take part in the conversation. For CWC, the radio show, we know from other assessment that about 20 to 30 students listen. But beyond that, we're getting another 70 to 80 downloads on average. And we'll talk some about who those people are, but for the most part, they're alumni or they're people totally removed from Bethel with no connection whatsoever. And then, if I can trumpet myself one last time, what's really been remarkable is what's happened with Radio Modern Europe. This was for a class that had 15 to 20 students. So for every student that I designed this for, I've had at least 100 people downloading every single episode. Wow. Which is not something, it didn't show up in 2007 because we were still behind the firewall, so you had to actually log in to get it. But then in 2008, without my realizing it, this all became open to the broader iTunes U universe, and suddenly someone wrote me an email saying, hey, I was listening to your episode about liberalism and socialism, and I thought, well, how did they find out about that? And I went on the iTunes U history page, and the 7th most downloaded podcast in all of the universe for history is liberalism and socialism, about which I know nothing. Remember? That was the point, is I was trying to get away from being the expert in the classroom, and I assumed, well, maybe it's because it says liberalism, and you're getting all sorts of political scientist types wanting to be rabble-roused or something. But then, if you look to this day, I think the 5th most popular one is this thing I did on resistance and collaboration just to set up a movie I was showing in class. So it's endured, and there's one on the origins of World War II that's been very popular, and one on 18th century European society that gets downloads. And I'm like, what on earth is happening with this? And what does that mean for how I teach it? So I started to think, well, my audience is not just those 15 or 20 students, but all these other people. How do I speak to them? And it poses a lot of practical problems, like they don't have access to the PowerPoints that I keep referring to, and GarageBand has limited abilities to let you put slides in, as I discovered recently. It actually cuts off half the image. So if I do this again, that's definitely something I'd be thinking about. Is, like it or not, that's part of my audience, and how do I speak to them in ways where I can still speak to my students and do the main objectives of the course? It's really remarkable. These are just the listener emails I've got from North America. So it ranges from everyone from college students in Washington, Philadelphia, to a dental student in Minneapolis, to a professor at Gustavus who wrote in. But it's also people like a software engineer in Palo Alto, a geneticist in Utah, a journalist in Hollywood, a linguist in Rhode Island, a Navy officer in Suffolk, Virginia, and my dad. Because he counts, because he didn't write in, but he told me about this in the car, and that counts. He's a pediatrician, so why should he care about European history if he loves CWC, the radio shows? Okay. And then it gets really wacky, because the first email I actually got came from way beyond North America, because I heard from this Dutch physician and a Danish college student, and then this guy in Colombia, and then this Spanish software engineer living in Ireland, and a Norwegian student living in Rwanda, Then a couple of guys from England wrote me, and then a history teacher in Australia, and then last month some American Marine officers serving with NATO's Central Command in Stuttgart. And while this immensely flatters me, and my ego can barely be contained in the space of this lovely library, it suggests that, maybe there's something Bethel could be doing here that we're maybe not doing quite yet. Or, even without us doing much, this still is happening. We didn't advertise this at all. All we did was, say this is a history podcast, and I put in some metadata. So presumably people search for liberalism, and my podcast shows up. So some modest proposals. What we can do. That's more self-flattery. Number one, I do think that there's a possibility here for some outreach and witness. You can think very crassly about this and say that Bethel has a declining traditional demographic. We should think about how to expand our profile, and I think we should do that. And, deans, this is one of the things you do. But I also think as an evangelical school, we have an opportunity here to speak to people who otherwise might never have heard of Bethel and might not know Christ. There are people who listen to a podcast about resistance and collaboration. I wasn't expressly setting out to convert people by doing that. I just wanted to set up something for my students. But in the process of doing that, I talk about Christian Holocaust rescuers, the people of Le Chambon, Corrie ten Boom. I talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But I also then talk about the fact that for the most part, the church acquiesces in or collaborates with Holocaust. And I talk about the Bonhoeffer effect, which is that Christians become convinced that Bonhoeffer is typical and everyone's a hero. And I think that's really useful. This might be a way to bring people who are not even Christian to think about this and to see modeled for them an evangelical doing history, being critical about the church, even though he loves the church. And I think there's really an important thing we could do here. One thing that Sam and I have talked about, and again, Sam should be doing this as much as I do, because if you want ideas, just go over there, because he has an idea for every person here on a podcast you could do, would be to do something like a Best of Bethel series. You identify good teachers from across the disciplines, from seminary, college, CAPS, whatever, and you do a series, and you promote it somehow. And this is a way to get our name out, but also to talk about this is what it means for evangelicals to be doing political science, or doing education, or doing computer science, or doing history, or doing digital librarian work, and doing psychology, and I'll stop there. I don't want to name every single person here, although you're all great. I think that it would take some effort. I would have to convince those good teachers that this is worth their doing. I think there's compensation involved, but I think that for the institution, that's something to consider. Another thing we could certainly do, it'd be very easy. I mentioned the Polycast as an example of this, but Sam and I have talked about the possibility of doing a departmental newsletter for the history department in place of the actual newsletter that we used to do, once every 3 years and pass out at homecoming. Maybe once or twice a year we do like a 30-minute podcast that updates, what are our students doing, what are our graduates doing, what are our professors researching. Might have an interview. Like, we think everyone should hear Kevin Craig's intellectual autobiography, to hear how some guy from Anoka County ended up at Wheaton and then studied ancient history and then became an environmental historian. And I think that's useful for our students to hear, because they might not have heard it, but we get to hear it because we have meetings with them. Or they can hear from GW. Okay, so this is a way to connect with alumni, prospective students, certainly a way that departments can talk to people who are interested in doing psychology and doing education. What does that mean at Bethel? It's a way to kind of reassure parents about what's going on with like interreligious symposia thing. Donors the same way. Another thing that I've thought a lot about, partly because I'm in leadership at my church right now, and we just met with our adult Sunday school team, is that for a lot of churches right now, doing especially adult Christian formation, but generally Christian formation is difficult, especially in this economy, a good place to cut budget, not to pay fancy Bethel professors to come in and talk. I wonder if there's a way here where we can do some service to churches in the Twin Cities and beyond. Develop libraries and podcasts that people can use, create curricula. We could charge for the curricula that people can design courses around. Sam and I are currently talking about developing like an online CWC. I'd love to see something like a church history course available for adults. The churches that otherwise could not afford to do this could do, and I think most departments could develop something like this. Again, it would take time, take investment by the institution, again, some compensation, I think. But I think that helps us serve one of our constituencies that sometimes we get detached from. Another interesting thing that's happened is that we found that some of the listeners to CWC, the radio show, are some English lit people down in Florida and Georgia who started to write into the show and just say, we're interested. We're evangelicals who study the humanities. We like what you're doing. And last month they started doing their own podcast. And we've got this neat little synergy thing happening where we talk about each other's topics. And we've even, Sam's been speculating about the possibility of doing some like film series across institutions. I talked with Adam about the possibility he wanted to do a conversation with a colleague, I think at the U of M, and maybe play it for students as a supplement so he could model, what does a professional conversation in the academy look like. But I mean, this is a way to get past geographic boundaries and to work as part of this communal scholarly effort and think we're not just doing it by ourselves. Here at Bethel, I'd love to do something with like historians at Wheaton or Westmont or Gordon, or historians at places like the U of M or at Yale, the godless secular academy. Now, to do this and to make it successful, let me make a couple of other very practical suggestions. Number one, we need to redesign the Bethel iTunes U page. And I'm not even going to show it to you, but it's very clearly designed for people who are already at Bethel. If you want to find CWC, the radio show, you need to know that that's part of the Division of General Education and Academic Services because we've got an organizational model. If you look at almost any other college or university, they've got fields, topics you can search from, recent uploads, most popular. Every week they feature something different. They encourage you to come in and try things out, and we're not doing that right now. And again, to beat a dead horse, don't just lecture. If you're going to do this, don't just stick a recorder and talk and expect that's going to connect. Of the listener comments I get, the number one thing that comes up is people say, "Oh, thank God you're not just doing a recorded lecture." This is a new technology that permits us to do things other than just record us talking. And I think the easy thing to do is just to record. Like a pet peeve of mine is the most popular modern European history podcasts are from Cal Berkeley, and it's just someone recording their lecture and requiring their students to listen. And it's really not fair. It's really not the same thing. And it's not good. It's really not good. So I would suggest Bethel could become a center of innovation here. Thinking through how you can use podcasts creatively and do some or all of these things. Okay, that's the section of the talk where I'm very excited about technology and podcasting. Let me come to what I think is really the meat of the talk and where my teaching has run into my scholarship. For reasons surpassing human understanding, a diplomatic historian has been studying pietist models of higher education for the last 2 years. And as I study Bethel's history and the history of North Park University, which is the Covenant School in Chicago, I come to think that what we do that's distinctive and valuable is maybe difficult to do online. And here what I would say is that face-to-face learning is central to our distinctive approach to not just higher education, but Christian. Now, students, in the world of the academy, this is what's called a duh argument. Of course, I don't think anyone here disagrees. I don't want to build a straw man and say that we're going to turn into Capella, which is an online school my brother works for. If we did, building a $30 million university commons was a bad economic decision because we don't need that so much. I assume we're going to stay a school where this is still important, but it's important for us to think about why we do that. Not just to assume that, of course, because we've done it before, that's the best way to do it, but why do we think it's valuable that we meet with students, not just in classrooms, but office hours, in the commons, in our homes? And those of you who've been here a long time can probably explain this much better because it's part of your existence. You have lived and breathed this, and you know why this is a distinctive, valuable place. I've been here for 7 years. I've researched the history, and so these are my tentative suggestions about why we're distinctive and why face-to-face is so integral to that. So one thing I would say is that in a pietist model of Christian education, like Bethel's or North Park, what we're doing fundamentally, it's not grandiose, is we're doing salvation work. This is not about information. And so no significant difference literature to me is interesting, but fundamentally not the highest thing we should be thinking about. We are interested in transformational experiences. And you could listen to Jay Barnes, because he talks about this all the time. But here, let me suggest someone from my own tradition, from evangelical Hoffman. The president of North Park College back in the 1950s and 60s was a guy named Carl Olson. Not, it's Richard Daley, who I don't think is interested in Christian higher education too much. That's from Stacy, so I should shut up. Carl Olson in 1961 talked to the North Park faculty and said this, and I can't tell you how much this has transformed the way I think about education. He said, "We seek to bring the student to personal fulfillment and to his eventual salvation. The school is not solely or even primarily interested in becoming cooks and bakers, engineers and physicists, teachers and preachers. It's not even interested primarily in giving its students the zest and joy of intellectual and aesthetic adventure, the burning corolla of the world, the ravishment of line and color and tone, the bitterness and delight of ideas, the ice and luxuriance of style. It's primarily interested in pointing beyond itself and beyond all created things to the source of life and truth, but by giving himself to us sustains within us the hunger for salvation." And this, I mean, that's not going to stop me from, giving quizzes to students and making sure they know kind of the sequence of European history, but that is not what I'm fundamentally trying to do. If Olson is right, all of this that we do, whether it's teaching or this library or what we do on the athletic field or when we do Festival of Christmas, it's all pointing to Christ. And for a pietist like Olson, what this means is talking about conversion and about regeneration, about new life in Christ is how Covenanters talk about it. And this is what we are doing with our students and with each other as colleagues. So, what does that mean? Well, he would also say, being a pietist, this affects the whole person. It's not just about the life of the mind, but it's about, talk about aesthetics, it's about the body, it's about the spirit. And obviously, there are things a fully online school could not do. It cannot do residential life and all the advantages that come with that. It can't do Festival of Christmas. It's not going to have people playing together in the sports field, rehearsing together in choir or for a play. And it's not going to have worship together in the same way we can do in chapel or in vespers or in prayer meetings or riots or whatever it is. And we can't serve people. And that's a really important part that I don't have time to get to, but it's very hard, I think, for an online school to serve the poor in North Minneapolis or West Virginia or Guatemala in the way that I think we're able to do as a brick and mortar kind of community. But let me bracket that off, and let me just say, even within academics, in the sense that academic cognitive studies somehow is salvific, I think that there's something about face-to-face that online cannot do. And to understand this, let me talk a little bit about epistemology, try to skirt through that without embarrassing myself, and then I'll try to make an important argument from our own history, and that's from Karl Lundquist, the long-serving president of Bethel. In his 1959 report, he would agree with Carl Olson and say that the unifying center of the academic program is neither truth nor the pursuit of truth, but is Jesus Christ himself. Ultimately, in our Christian view, truth and Christ are one. The important thing about truth is that it ought to point to Christ. So, number one epistemic point, truth is personal. It's not this abstract thing just kind of scattered out there in the universe. It's not a random kind of collision of processes and structures, but actually is identified with person, but with a certain kind of person. The God of Olson and Lundquist, and I think of all of us, is not the detached deist watchmaker. And he's not the kind of unchanging, unfeeling logos of Greek philosophy. The God that we're talking about here is someone who feels deeply, who weeps with us, who mourns with us, who rejoices with us, and who wants relationship with us. So, I mean, there's some relational dimension to truth that, that might be more difficult to get with online. After he retired, Karl Lundquist established something called the Evangelical Order of the Burning Heart and promoted Christian spirituality and put out occasional newsletters. In one, reflecting on something Parker Palmer had wrote, he said that the truth is both personal and propositional. But then he rejected the kind of reformed approach that's primarily propositional and said the truth is in fact troth, a way of loving. And it's motivated not only by curiosity and the desire to be in control, but by compassion. According to no significant difference literature, it's very possible for students in online classes to master knowledge and to have mastery of skills. But if this is true, that is not what truth is primarily about. It's about a relationship. Now, can that happen within the confines of an online course? Absolutely. All things are possible with God. I don't want to say that you can't have a relationship between me talking into a recorded podcast and someone listening even a year later to what I have to say. That's entirely possible. But I have to say that I think there's something unique about that face-to-face contact that helps us get at truth in this special way. And here, you point to what I think, for me, the most important thing Karl Lundquist ever said, and that explains why Bethel is different. Lundquist, in explaining why, if he had to, he would sacrifice academic qualifications with teachers for their Christian character, said this: "We believe that in the end, the impact of one life upon another is probably greater than the impact of an idea or a method of teaching or a favorable physical setting. At Bethel, we want our young people to enter into personal contact with their teachers, and we hope to keep such academic paraphernalia as the curriculum, course credits, class hours, and examinations from getting in the way of this relationship." Now, this is not to say that simply because you've got a classroom, this is going to work. He says physical setting maybe isn't the most important thing. But I do wonder if stressing online too much does get in the way here. Does that create a barrier between the establishment of Edgren's friendly, helpful relationships that we talk about at convocation all the time? And so I think a final thing I'd emphasize about a pietist model of Christian higher education is that it's fundamentally done in community. We do not do this one-on-one. We don't do this by ourselves in front of a computer, but it's done in a community. Now, those of you who are devotees of online education or online church, I will say you can have community online. There are thriving online churches. And if you're interested, go to the Out of Ur blog from Christianity Today. They're having a nice discussion / debate about this. It's possible in the history of the church to see community that does not have people meeting together. In CWC and Humanities, we talk about the cloud of witnesses. Even as Protestants, we believe that we are introducing students to a community of brothers and sisters who have gone before us and are separated not just by geography, but by time and by the veil of death. And that's a community of sorts. And technology can help. Paul writing his epistles to the scattered Christian communities of the Mediterranean basin is using a kind of technology. In Philippians 1, verse 7, he says that he cherishes that these Philippians are with him in his heart, and that they share with him in God's grace, even though he's not present with them. But in the next verse, he says that even still, he cannot tell them how much he longs for them and how much he yearns for them. And there is something about this embodied, gathered community that seems essential to what Christians do as the body of Christ, and that maybe not, in most situations, for most people, be reproduced by something like online education. And here are two ways to think more about this, to stop using the word community. As a pietist, maybe we should think about the college as an ecclesiola. So in 17th century Germany, the pietists, people like Spener and Franke, not only went to church, but they also met in conventicles, or small groups, or Wesley's going to call them cell groups. Many of us do today. And these are called ecclesiolae in ecclesia. So they're not replacing the church that distributes sacraments and proclaims the word, but they are also meeting as little churches within the church. And I kind of like that idea for thinking about what a Christian college does. We do not supplant the church. We do not do the same thing as a church that baptizes people, that distributes grace through the Eucharist or through communion. But we are a kind of church. I guess I have to disagree slightly with Jay in his blog when he says we were birthed from the church, but we're different from the church. I think this is the body of Christ. And it's supposed to be like the body of Christ in some ways. And I like this idea of getting together in small groups like classes or other kinds of small groups and having fellowship as a part of the learning process. And here I think about a couple of comments from students. One I think is kind of funny, but might point at something larger. One of my students who took the Modern Era class last fall told me that she had actually listened to the podcast sitting in the classroom. She would show up at the time the class normally would have been held, sit at a desk, take out her notebook, and listen to the podcast as if I were up there speaking. Now, that might just be that it just helps her, that physical presence, maybe there was muscle memory or something. But it suggests to me there's something about being in that space and sharing that space maybe that she misses. I know I miss it. That's the main reason I'm not doing this again, is it means that 10 times during the semester I don't see my students as much. And I think that if you're going to do that, you need to find other ways to supplement that, having students over to your house, meeting with them informally somehow. Another point I would make, a graduate from a few years back, Mike Booman, who's teaching English in China, came back and talked to me one summer, and he's teaching himself and starting to think through what makes for effective teaching. And looking back, he said there was always a difference between taking classes with professors that he never got to know outside of class and those that he established relationships with, like Ruben, who has had Mike over for lunch and dinner many times. He said he could get information from people he didn't know well, and he could do fine in the class and then move on, but he was only formed in classes with someone that he knew deeply. And there's it's a level of trust or something, but there's some way in which we encounter the personal God of truth through other people. And maybe that happens better when there's some kind of embodied face-to-face relationship. Another way to think about this is that church is not a word that shows up often in the New Testament. It's actually gathering or fellowship, koinonia. So in Acts 2:42 through 47, after Pentecost, we get the story of this gathering, this fellowship of believers that share devotion and study and prayer and fellowship and share their goods with each other. Just all sorts of things that, can we do that here at Bethel? I think we should. One way to think about this comes from another covenant theologian. Don Frisk was dean of the seminary back in the 1960s. And he wrote this about koinonia. Real koinonia is never achieved in the abstract. It arises only in real sharing by real flesh and blood people in a particular place and situation. Love comes to sharpest focus in the congregation where we meet, not humanity in general, but human beings in all the concreteness of their personal existence. In the give and take of the fellowship, we learn the richness of Christ's love and mercy, as well as the severity of his judgment. Where there is this kind of open relationship, the community can be the agent through which the Holy Spirit moves and works. Now, I'm willing to believe the Holy Spirit can move and work through podcasting. I do not disbelieve that. I tend to suspect this is where the Holy Spirit moves best, and this is what we are called to be. It is this kind of embodied, gathered koinonia. And we should be leery then of pushing too far into the online world if we start to lose this dimension of who we are. So to wrap up, I would suggest online education can be effective. It can actually promote at least kind of low-level knowledge and skill outcomes, and maybe it can expand who we're able to talk to and reinforce some relationships that otherwise are difficult to maintain. But what I think is most distinctive and valuable about a Bethel education, a Pietist education, a Christian education, is that we seek the salvation of people who learn of Christ in community with each other. And I guess I'm still cautious about what happens if you push too much towards doing this online. So those are my reflections. Thank you for helping me survive this talk. Have a great day.